So if you're anything like me, you probably find it quite difficult to mentally switch off at the end of each day, because even as the day finishes, it's very rare that actual projects or assignments that we're working on also become finished. They often remain incomplete. And because they're incomplete, they end up playing on our mind long into the hours of what should be our downtime. So why does this happen, and is there anything we can do to mentally detach after a hard day of working on our craft? Well, today's video is going to talk about 3 very simple things that you can implement so that you can gain a little bit more mental clarity at the end of each day. But first, it's important to understand, why is it that we can't seem to detach ourselves from ongoing projects or assignments? Well, the answer lies in a restaurant in Vienna in the 1920s when a psychologist by the name of Bulma Zyganik noticed something quite interesting about waiters. She became amazed at how they could remember very large table orders without writing a single thing down. They would come to the table with all the food and not have to be given any sort of reminder as to who had ordered what. After leaving the restaurant, one of Zyganik's friends realised she had forgotten something, so headed back to the restaurant and went in search of her waiter because of his fantastic memory so that he could help her. But she was rather amazed to discover that he just looked at her completely as if he had never seen her ever before in his life. And so she asked him, well, how could you remember all of our orders but not recognise me? And he very simply said, well, I remember orders up until they're completed, and then I forget them. So Zyganik pondered on this mystery and eventually developed what is now known as the Zyganik effect, which is the idea that we remember incomplete tasks far better than we do completed ones. And one of the main explanations for why this effect occurs is that it's our unconscious mind deliberately trying to seek the assistance and help from our conscious mind. So think of it as a small child tugging on the sleeve of an adult to get their attention and help. And that's why we can't ultimately switch off. So what can we do to resolve this? Well, there's 3 things that I argue all of us can do to help eliminate this Zyganik effect. Tip number 1 is plan out tomorrow's to-do list today. Quite simply, the act of taking this definitive step of planning out our next course of action is so key, because doing this ultimately pacifies that whiny unconscious of ours. And there's a lot of interesting research to support this. So in 2011, 2 psychologists by the names of E.J. Masacampo and Roy Baumeister found in a study that you can eliminate the Zyganik effect by very simply making plans. Within their experiment, they asked all participants to reflect on very important projects within their lives, and they then separated them into 3 different groups. Group 1 was told to write about some tasks that they had recently completed. Group 2 were asked to write about some tasks that were unfulfilled and needed to be completed soon. And Group 3 were asked also to write about unfulfilled tasks, but also make very simple plans of what they were going to do next to help achieve them. And following this, all 3 groups then took part in a short 10-minute reading task, during which the researchers would interrupt them and ask them if they were having any wandering thoughts, and also how easy they were finding it to focus on the task at hand. The researchers then tested the participants on their comprehension of the reading task. And what Masacampo and Baumeister found was that those who had written about unfulfilled tasks had far greater difficulty in remaining focused during the reading task. However, those who had written about unfulfilled tasks but had also written plans as to how they were going to tackle them reported very little mind wandering and actually scored much better in the reading comprehension test. So the simple act of making a very basic plan all but eliminated the Zyganik effect. So think of it as giving the child that is your unconscious a lollipop to shut it up. So it's clear that if we don't plan out our next actions, our mind is just going to wander back to the fact that the task is incomplete. And that's why planning out tomorrow's to-do list today is so important, so that you can have that peace of mind in your evening and in your downtime. And tip number 2 is to set daily checkpoints. So as you may know, writers set daily word counts. They don't try to write the whole book in one day. And reaching these checkpoints ultimately tricks your brain into thinking that you have completed the task, because you have, it's just a smaller version of it. So the way to think about this is kind of like a video game. You wouldn't necessarily try to complete the whole game in one sitting. You'll set yourself maybe smaller targets of reaching a certain mission, and once you've reached that point, you can happily switch it off and come back to it the next day. And your brain doesn't then go into overdrive panic mode trying to tell you to complete the game as soon as possible. It becomes quite content that you've made a fixed level of progress. So in our real lives, it's far better to be more deliberate and intentional about what are realistic and acceptable standards to reach on a daily basis? Points at which we can be content with the progress that we've made. Because doing this will subside any of that unrelenting urgency, which is another key characteristic of the Zeigarnik effect. So if you can redirect that fixation onto smaller set tasks or immediate term actions, you're going to be able to quiet that unconscious mind because you are making that progress that feels like things are being completed. Because they're just being broken down into much more manageable chunks. And tip number 3 is to engage in proper leisure and not escapism. Now, this is something I only recently came across from reading Ryan Holiday's latest book, Stillness is the Key. And he makes the very convincing argument that most people engage in quite counterproductive escapism rather than engaging in what he calls more restorative leisure. By escapism, we mean things like excessive drinking, binge eating, gambling, extramarital affairs. Now, fortunately, most of us don't engage in those kinds of vices, but a lot of us still do go for some more general, but still equally harmful forms of escapism. So the typical one being just slapping on Netflix and watching an episode of a series that you've already seen 5 times and then start scrolling through social media whilst you're not even watching. And as we scroll through endless social media feeds, we see other people who are apparently more happy, more productive, and more carefree than us. And so invariably we end up feeling guilty again. We feel that we need to be more productive if we're going to be more successful. And so all those thoughts about our ongoing projects, goals and assignments all come flooding back, and the Zeigarnik effect takes full force again. Whereas in contrast, leisure enables a full sense of stillness where you don't feel frantic and you can actually feel at one with the task that you're engaging with. And this is because true leisure fully occupies our minds. It doesn't necessarily have to be something mentally exhausting, but it requires us to be really at one with what we're doing at that given moment. So things such as making a fresh meal from scratch, doing some painting, having a read, writing, or even exercise. And there's an amazing book on the restorative power of leisure by Alex Soon-Jung King-Pang. And one fantastic example that the book details is that of Dwight Eisenhower, who, before becoming president, was a commanding general for the US Army during World War II, and he was positioned in London. And during this time, he got fully caught up with the demands of his role, which meant that he was often pulling 15 to 18-hour days. And because of this, he instructed his aide, Harry Butcher, to find him a hideout. And Butcher ultimately found Telegraph College, where Eisenhower would escape to recharge his batteries. There he would play golf, go horse riding, read cowboy novels, play bridge, and just enjoy some peace and tranquility. And this ultimately allowed Eisenhower to fully detach from the perpetual demands of his role so that he could come back every day refreshed and ready to make better decisions. So if someone with that level of responsibility during a world war can carve out some time for leisure, then there's no excuse for any of us. So to sum up, the Zeigarnik effect is something that is just naturally embedded into our way of thinking. And it's obviously very beneficial in certain situations, but unfortunately, because of the demands that are placed on us in society today, it often becomes all-consuming. And because of that, we need to make active efforts to eliminate it. But this is something that can be achieved, and it's as simple as planning out our day the night before, identifying some regular checkpoints to reach, and also by embracing proper leisure time so that we can ultimately find some inner peace. Thanks very much for watching. I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions about how to implement these tips in your life, feel free to ask me some questions in the comments below and I'll get back to you. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want more videos similar to this, then do hit that subscribe button and I'll see you in the next video.